After his 22-year-old son, John, died in a motorcycle accident, Bill Kaspari's grief propelled him to understand whether life continues beyond the grave. Gradually, an unseen world began to reveal itself in the years following his son's death. His inquiry resulted in a book, The Galilean Pendulum. Here he presents his story to the South Bay chapter of the International Association for Near-Death Studies.
Good evening, everybody. So am I using this microphone, right?
Just close, that's all.
Yeah. Okay, I know I'm at an International Association of Near-Death Studies, and I understand that there are a few people here who have actually had near-death experiences. And I want to tell you that I'm a little bit jealous because I got a pretty good whack on the head when I was around 30 years old. And after that time, I started passing out. And at first it was infrequent, once a year, once every couple of years, but as time went on, I kept passing out more and more. And to the point where this was happening monthly almost. And so, fortunately, I had another accident. I ended up in the hospital. I cracked some ribs in that, and they had electrodes on me, ECG electrodes. And what happened was I passed out, and it turned out that my heart stopped. It slowed down to like 10 beats a minute for about 30 seconds and then flatlined. And then for some reason it just fires up again. So all that time, of all those dozens and dozens of nearly dying, I never once got to see the other side. So I'm kind of jealous of all you guys. But what happened to me was a lot worse. In 1967, my first son Ricky was born. And that day, I mean, I can't tell you how elated I was. I was just so happy, and went to the hospital the next day to see my wife and the little baby, and a doctor said there's something wrong. I'm going to have him sent down to Stanford. He was born at Sequoia Hospital in Redwood City. Turned out he had a very serious heart defect. It's called truncus arteriosus, where the aorta and the pulmonary artery are combined. The red blood, the blue blood, they're all mixed up, and he only lived for a few months. And that was really hard. I mean, I can tell you that, especially it was my first son, and it hurt a lot. But, you know, a couple of years later, my son John was born, and next year or so, my first daughter, Becky, and then a few years later, my daughter Angie. And life went on, and everything was beautiful again. You know, life was good. We were happy, and we did all the camping and all the things that you do with your kids. And then one day, my son John was a student down in San Luis Obispo. And I got a call saying that John was killed tonight in a motorcycle accident. And that just destroyed me because I had gotten so close to him, especially after losing my first son, that I'm going to tell you, I was just devastated. In fact, I remember the night that, the day that we buried Ricky, I remember standing at the graveside, and they're going to put this little box down in the ground there, and my wife was just crying, and I wouldn't let myself cry. You know, I just know men aren't supposed to cry, kind of a thing. Don't ask me why. I can't explain that. But when I lost John, it was the other way. I couldn't stop it. I was just so destroyed. For months, I would just break down and cry, and I was so devastated. But the night he died, I laid in bed, and I had 12 years of Catholic schooling, but for some reason it just didn't work for me. I'm one of those people, I'm just not a believer, you know. You've got to show me and prove it to me. I'm Mr. Doubting Thomas, that's me. And so I laid in bed that night, and I said to myself, you are going to try to figure out if you're ever going to see your son again. And I didn't know how I was going to do that. I really didn't think it probably was possible. But the next day, some friends who had lost a daughter, I don't know if any of you remember, there was a dormitory fire in Berkeley in 1990, and their daughter was killed. They came over the next day and handed me this Life After Life by Raymond Moody. And so I read that, and I thought, wow, that's kind of fascinating. And so I started looking for other books. I actually ended up subscribing to the IANDS magazine, but I still was getting nowhere. I was trying to figure this thing out from a scientific standpoint. I started reading all these books, you know, The Holographic Universe and Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking and all this kind of stuff, and it just wasn't working. And right after John died, probably within a couple of weeks, a friend of ours invited us over, And she said, you know, I have a friend here, and she didn't really describe what he was. Turned out he was a psychic. And she said, you know, if you'd like, it doesn't cost you anything, why don't you go ahead and sit down with him and have a meeting with him? And I said, you know, okay. I don't know, as far as I knew, he was a fortune teller or something, you know. And so we sat down, and he right away said something about, now, you lost a son recently, and he died suddenly, and all that. And I thought, well, yeah, that's true, but maybe somebody told him, you know, I'm still Mr. Questioner. And he read our auras, and he told me I was an old soul, and I thought, well, I guess that's good. You know, I don't know what it means exactly. And so, but what finally stuck in my mind was about 2 weeks later, my wife Diane she was just hurting. And she said, I think I'm going to call Pat McEnany and see if he's heard from my son, you know, did he any messages for us? And so she called Pat, and he said, you're going to get an important letter within the next day or two. Okay. That was pretty much it, you know. So the next day, my wife goes out to the mailbox. There's a letter from the boy who was responsible for our son's death. And I thought, wow, wait a minute, how did he know that, you know? So I didn't know anything. And I'd had some other sort of preliminary views of paranormal things. I was reading a lot of books. I read Robert Monroe's How to Get Out of Your Body, and I attempted that. I bought the tapes in those days, you know, and put them in a little Sony Walkman, and I was trying. I almost succeeded one time, I think. I felt the vibrations, and then all of a sudden it stopped. There was a lady named Edith Fiore who turned out lived in Saratoga. I found out about her, and I went over there and had a past life regression. That was pretty interesting. But I was still really not getting the picture. You know, I didn't know, I was still searching, but I really didn't know where to look. And in fact, after about 10 years after John died, I was sitting, I live in Portola Valley, and there's a place called Rosati's there, it's the Alpine Inn. And, you know, Sunday afternoon, and there's a group of us hanging around there. And this young lady comes up to me, and she walks up to me, and I didn't know her, we'd never met each other. And she said, are you a shaman? I went like, me? what are you smoking, you know? And I said, why do you ask? She says, well, I see spirits all around you. I'm going like, whoa, that's good, I guess. And so I said, well, do you do readings? And she said, sure. And I said, so I set up an appointment for a couple of days later, and I went over to her place. And just as I was walking in, she said, you know, I almost called you yesterday. She said it was around like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She said, and I had this vision of you falling down an embankment. There was a big tree there, and she described it as embankment with a creek down there. And she said, I almost called you about that. Well, that really got to me, because that day, around that time, I'd been out in the back chopping wood, you know, splitting up some logs, and some of the logs had fallen down the embankment. There's a creek around my place. Had fallen down this embankment, and so I went down to get them, and I slipped and fell into the creek. And then she said, and by the way, there was this young man who was standing there laughing at you. Well, I was the only guy there. So first of all, it was, how did she know that I fell down that embankment? She didn't even know where I lived. And for her to tell me that somebody was there laughing, and so I just told her, I said, that must have been John, I think he pushed me, you know. And so that was, I had all these glimpses, but I was still not getting, I just wasn't satisfied with what I was learning. And then I had a sort of a breakthrough. One evening I was sitting on my couch at home and turned on the TV, you know, and that typical guy flipping through the channels. And for some reason I stopped at Bill O'Reilly, you know, Mr. O'Reilly Factor guy. And just as I stopped, he said, okay, folks, one more time. My guest is Gary Schwartz. The name of his book is The Afterlife Experiments, Breakthrough Scientific Evidence of Life After Death. And I'm like, whoa, that's mine, you know? And so I wrote down the name and that, and wrote a letter to him, and I never heard anything. And so I started searching for his email, and finally I found his email. And he did reply to that, and I said, I've got to talk to you about this, you know, because his book was, he was testing mediums. For those of you who've never heard of Gary Schwartz, he's a professor at the University of Arizona, and very involved in those days in testing mediums. And this was around November of 2002. So I contacted him, we communicated back and forth, and he said, I'm going to be in the city in November. You want to meet me at my hotel? And so I met him at his hotel, and is this working? Yeah. I met him at his hotel in San Francisco up on Van Ness, and I told him what happened, that I'd lost my son, and that I really was interested in his approach to trying to understand the afterlife, and how could I get involved. And so we talked a little bit, and I ended up inviting him to my house for dinner that night, and so he came over, Diane fixed a nice dinner, and after dinner he says, Bill, he said, he gets out his laptop, he says, I'm going to send an email to a few people. Well, I didn't know what he was doing, had no idea. What it turned out he was doing was he was sending an email to 3 different mediums that he was testing. None of them were in anywhere, they were in California even, they weren't anywhere near here. And all he gave them was the name of my son John, and see what you get. Well, I don't know. And so I drove him to the airport, and he said, now when you get these emails, he said, I'm going to forward these responses from these 3 ladies, 3 mediums. I want you to score them the way the way I scored them in my book. And so I get these readings, and the first one, at first I was like, I'm kind of confused about all this. First he says, I'm getting, John, is he traveling a lot? And it's almost like he's going to foreign countries. Susie's showing me all these different countries, and there's a lot of traveling to foreign countries. I thought, well, no. He was in the MA Jazz Band and went to Europe one time, but that was it. Now he's showing me his throat. There's something wrong with his throat. No, he was a pretty healthy kid. Oh, wait a minute. Did he grow up in poverty? Something he's telling me he grew up in poverty, that he was very poor, but he believed that if you work hard and everything, you'll do fine. I'm going, poverty? This kid grew up in Portola Valley, So, what are you talking about? And then she says, now I'm being shown something about Hawaii, flowers that remind me of Hawaii. Did something happen in the garden in Hawaii? And I'm going, wait a minute. My dad, who was named John, everything she was coming up with, and this was Janet Mayer, everything she came up with fit my dad to a T. He traveled, he was an engineer back in the late 50s, early 60s, when we were putting up all these satellite tracking stations. My dad was traveling all over, he'd been to every continent there was except Antarctica, I think, in doing that. Did he have a problem with his throat? Well, I remember the last time I visited him in Hawaii, he had this big, long leather tube, about like that was filled with mercury, a very skinny tube, and he had to put that thing down his throat to open his throat up. I thought, boy, that's barbaric. I don't think I'll ever do that, but that was my dad. He did grow up in poverty. His dad died when he was 6 years old. His mother took him, washed. They lived in a boxcar, all that kind of stuff, And then what happened in Hawaii? Well, the garden in Hawaii, my son John and I, just before each of them died, were over there, did some work in his garden. So everything just fit him. That's also where he had his heart attack. So I'm like, whoa, this is pretty good, but I want to hear from my son John, what's going on? I didn't expect my dad, I was happy to find out, but at the same time I thought, how does this woman, wherever she is, know all this stuff about my dad? I didn't even mention my dad to Gary, so if Gary was somehow feeding her information, he didn't have any of that. And then I forget, it was the next one of the next 2 readings, she starts off with, boy, this kid won't leave me alone, I'm hearing Eric Clapton's Tears in Heaven. She said, all morning long, I've been hearing this, and she said, it was music a big part of this young man's life, or this man's life? Was that important? Well, yeah, he was in the MA Jazz Band, and they went to Europe a couple of times and played in the jazz festival in Europe. And she says, I'm was there a tribute to him? Well, yes, a friend of ours set up a scholarship, funded MA for the band scholar of the year. Now I'm being shown the Woody doll being flipped around. She says, no, first she says, I'm getting grazed as if there's trauma to the chest and the head area, and now the Woody doll's being flipped around. Well, that's what happened to my son. He was on the back of a motorcycle. Turned out, I didn't even know he had it. It was his motorcycle, but he asked another boy to drive. They'd been out having a couple of beers, gave the other boy his helmet, and this kind of stuff. And the kid lost control, put my son into a pole, and that was it. So being flopped around like the Woody doll in Toy Story, right? And the chest trauma, it wasn't like he didn't die from cancer or drowning or anything else. It was head and chest trauma. That was dead on. And then suddenly she switches. I'm being shown, now there's a young girl, she says she's with him. And I'm being shown a starry night, something about stars and the starry light, star night. And that one just blew me away, because after John died, a couple of years later, my younger daughter Angie, went off to college in Colorado with her best friend. And one night, my daughter wasn't with her, but some of the kids were out on this gorgeous, beautiful, moonlit night. And there's a mountain called Flagstaff Mountain in Boulder, Colorado. And they were driving up this road, up this steep road. And two of the kids, one was a boy laying on top of the driver's side, on top of this SUV, looking at the stars. And next to him was this girl, Amanda, who was my daughter's best friend. And the kid driving this vehicle suddenly puts the right wheel into the ditch, the drainage ditch. The truck falls over, Amanda falls off, and that was the end of her. And somehow, turns out Janet is picking this up. How does she get this image about a starry night and all this kind of stuff? And I'm going to tell you, when I got all that information, that you talk about the skepticism being blown away, that did it for me. And so then I got involved with Gary Schwartz. After that time, set up a small fund for my son down at the University of Arizona. And for those of you who don't know Gary, he's a Harvard PhD, MD, he's got umpteen titles after his name and all this kind of stuff. But he was trying to come up with a way to scientifically determine how do mediums do what they do? How do they get the information they do? And it was more, not so much physiologically, how does this work, but how can we verify that this stuff is real, this is valid information? And so we started off in his book, it was just is it right or wrong? In a scale of +3 to -3. +3 being, yep, dead on, and -3, no, totally wrong. And so I got involved in another guy, and we started coming up with more criteria, like, well, it can be true, yeah, he has brown hair, but so does how many other people, It should be meaningful, it should be unique, something specific to that individual. We were doing triple-blind, double-blind, triple-blind studies and that sort of thing. And after a few years of that, I just sort of was convinced. Now I believe that all of this is real, There were a couple of other incidents that I was still searching for how does this work? How can they know what's going on here? And so one day, there were a couple of there was a predictive reading. Alison Dubois, who was the person that the show Medium was based on, she was one of the ladies that I'd gotten some readings from. And in one of her readings, she says, I'm being told at Christmas time, look for a Christmas tree ornament around Christmas time, a special ornament. So I thought, well, I forgot about it. Christmas tree ornament, what am I supposed to do with that? And one day, right around Christmas time, I'm sitting down on the couch, and my wife had bought some of these lights that blink on and off, drive you crazy. We decided we didn't like them, so we got rid of them all. And I'm sitting on the couch, and I look up there, and I see one light blinking. Well, now, wait a minute. If it was a whole string, not just one would be blinking. So I get up to go look and see what's going on, and the light is gone. Go sit down, comes back on again, it's still blinking. I did that a couple times, and then I fixed in my mind, where is that light? And I went over there, and it turned out that what was happening, there was a Christmas tree ornament that was rotating. The heater vent was moving it back and forth, and so there was this red light bulb near it that it was reflecting this light. Well, so okay, big deal, except that Allison had predicted that. And the particular ornament that was doing this was one that my son, or that my wife bought, that was when we were in Alaska, in memory of my son who had been in Alaska. That particular ornament was the only one that was the one that was involved. And so, you know, I'm getting all these signs. The last reading one day, toward the end of all this, and my involvement with Gary Schwartz and so forth, I get an email, and it's from Janet Mayer again. And she says, I don't know what's going on, something about a birth and a death, and it's not making any sense to me again, as usual. I'm pretty clueless. And so finally, she says, and did Bill or somebody connected Bill, get a big gash over their right eye? Did something happen? And I went, okay, I'm getting the message. My son-in-law, the night before, had been over to my daughter's house, and she showed me a big gash over my son-in-law's right eye, which is exactly the way Janet called it. He got up in the middle of the night, his beeper or something was going off, and he wanted to hurry up and find it and turn it off before it woke up their daughters. And he walked right into the wall and gets this big gash over his right eye. And so I thought about that, and I thought about all this other stuff, and finally, you know, it finally dawned on me that what is really going on here, Bill, is we're in a fishbowl. They know what we're doing. They're around us, they can see us, they can tell what we're doing. And how long did it take me? 20 years? It finally sunk in, and probably a lot of you people already understand that, but I didn't. And so what happened was the only thing that I was still, when I was working with Gary Schwartz, one of the things, once I became convinced that there was an afterlife, I wanted to know what it was like. And so I said, Gary, I want to come up, let's come up with what we ended up calling the Asking Questions studies. And the goal of this study was to find out, so mediums get all this information, but can they ask questions and get answers? And so we put together some studies to try to determine, you know, the answer to that. And it turned out that the answer was yes. We could ask questions, you know, for example, we might say, what was John's favorite sports? Well, it wasn't football, it wasn't baseball, it wasn't basketball, it was swimming and tennis. Well, that's the answers that came back. And it turned out that I couldn't keep funding that research, and Gary was forced to go away from that. But what happened was sort of a serendipitous thing. One day Diane comes home with a book called The Fun of Dying, and a few people, written by Roberta Grimes. And what it is Roberta Grimes is an attorney who had an experience when she was a little, you know, what she calls an experience of light. I think she was like 5 years old or something like that. She had been raised religious, and she was conflicted because all the stuff that she was being taught in church was conflicting with a lot of her beliefs. So what she did, she went back and she stripped away all of the interpretations that were put on the gospel. She said, I just went back and read the gospels themselves, and she said that removed all of the conflicts that I had. And then she ended up in her book, she describes what the afterlife is like as revealed in the gospels. And right after that, there's a guy named Stafford Betty, who is a professor of religious studies at University of California, Bakersfield, or Cal State Bakersfield. And he wrote a book called The Afterlife Unveiled. What this guy did was he went back and he studied all of the documentation of over close to 100, 150 years of what 7 different mediums over that span of time. You know, some of them were way back, some of them more recently. And he describes in that book what these mediums have revealed as this is what the afterlife is like. You know, things like there is no hell. Hell is not some place where you know it's painful and you go there and you get punished and you burn up in fire. And nobody sits on a cloud floating around with a flute, you know, or a harp or any of that kind of stuff. And they described it. And the bottom line of all that is that the afterlife is not a lot different than here. In some ways, it's much better because you communicate telepathically. If you want to be here, you want to be 1,000 miles away, you just think it and you're there. It's a much more cheerful, happy place. There are different levels. And a lot of the Far Eastern tradition, for example, the Hindu traditions, it's what they've been teaching for centuries. And if you're interested in what really the next life is like, I would really recommend reading those books. I put summaries of those in my book, just to give you an idea, but the bottom line is that there is no end to life, that we just keep on moving on. Life is a continuum. When we leave this body, we're still in a sort of an ethereal body, in a much more beautiful place. Communication is much better, colors are indescribable, and that sort of thing. So my new mantra is enjoy life because it never ends. So make the best of it. Anybody have questions or?
Who is the author on The Afterlife Unveiled?
Stafford Betty, B-E-T-T-Y.
Well, may I ask a question?
Sure.
Well, my question is, were you ever able to reconnect with your son? Did you ever see him consciously or in a dream? Or?
Thank you, because I meant to put that into my talk and I got by it. I've had a number of lucid dreams with him, and they saved my life. That was happening before I understood all this stuff about mediums and that. In fact, about 6 months after he died, my wife said, "Oh, John came to me last night." My daughters, he came to me, and I'm like, "What about me? What did I do?" And my wife said, "You know what, Bill, you're probably just not open to it." Well, that's for sure. And one day I happened to be in Germany, and about 6 months later, and all of a sudden there was my son and my dad in a dream, and I knew something was different. I knew I was in a dream. I thought, wait a minute, I'm asleep. John is dead. That's my dad, and they're walking. And that just kind of blew me away. And after that, I started keeping notebooks. I've got a half a dozen these spiral notebooks where I've written down all these different dreams where he came to me. And by the way, I started a website because I want to promote, I just want to help other people understand that life never really ends. And in there, one of the things I put on this blog, and believe me, I'm still learning, is a story about how he came to me in a dream, what it was like. And I've got more response to that than in any other thing I put on that website so far. But that's, to answer your question, yeah, and that helps a lot.
What's the website?
Understandingafterlife.com.
Were you like digital or?